Peter, James, Paul elected to unhitch the Christian faith from their Jewish scriptures. And my friends, we must as well. And I'll tell you why. It's actually the same reason they did. Because we must not make it difficult for those Gentiles who are turning to God.
Let's talk a little bit about the subtitle.
I hope so. You raised a moment ago this idea that Christians think they should be free from the law, that's a sort of that we could set that in opposition to the grace in the New Testament. And I think one of the most prominent examples of how widespread this is was Andy Stanley's famous statement a year and a half ago while preaching through Acts 15, telling his church that it's okay to just unhitch from the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. Because we don't, as Christians, that's the backstory, but what we really need to zero in on is the resurrection. And so let's just unhitch. And I'm not trying to throw Andy Stanley under the bus here. I think he's a wonderful pastor and has got such a heart for reaching the lost. And he sees that when unbelievers begin reading the Old Testament, and even sometimes Christians are reading the Old Testament, there are barriers, there are things that are unpleasant that we read or we don't know what to do with, and he doesn't want that to stand in the way of anyone coming to Jesus. Mm-hmm. So let's just leave that aside. And my approach with the same problem is different. I say, let's educate people. Let's help them discover the Old Testament and what it's really saying so that it ceases to be a barrier to faith in Christ. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to unhitch. My book is trying to rehitch the Old Testament. I really believe that as Christians, we can't understand our identity or our vocation without Sinai. If we don't get Sinai right, we miss out on what is our purpose as believers.
Yeah. And again, that's well said. And again, here on this podcast, I've been a little crankier. You're just so much more pleasant than I am. I'll say things like, show me someone who wants to ditch the Old Testament. I'll show you someone who just can't comprehend the biblical theology. And it just, it's really, it's indispensable. And it's kind of, I feel silly saying, hey, 3/4 of your Bible is actually indispensable to understanding the Bible. Right. But that's kind of where we've come. Here we are having to say these sorts of things. It just feels a little bit weird.
And again, I do feel like I appreciate not only Andy Stanley's really great ability to hold an audience, and his one-point sermons are just captivating, but also appreciate his pastoral sensibilities. He wants people to meet Jesus. But what baffles me is when he takes them to Acts 15, he concludes that when the early church is meeting to decide what to do about Gentiles and deciding they don't need to be circumcised, that's evidence that they're throwing off or unhitching from the Old Testament, when in fact, when I read Acts 15, I see that they're going precisely to the Old Testament to find justification or grounds for how to include Gentiles in the covenant as Gentiles. They are unwilling to make the decision without the testimony of the Old Testament. So they are certainly not unhitching.
Right, and they only sort of remove, part of what the Old Testament is saying.
Right. I
don't know how you get there.
And the part that they remove is the part that was designed from the beginning to be an ethnic identity marker, to separate Jew from Gentile, so that the people of Israel could be a model that people see and see that they're different. And I think that's the bit that's changed now because of Jesus, is that the way is opened for Gentiles. And so now the laws that pertain to separating Jew from Gentile, so that would include kosher diet and circumcision chiefly, but other things as well, those have been set aside because we no longer need to make a dividing wall. Now the church is opened up, the covenant is opened up for Gentile membership.
Yeah, it's a very worthwhile thing to keep what you just said in mind, because Stanley's sensitivities are correct. There are things about the Old Testament that drive people away, especially in our culture. But it's like, look, we have to realize that this was there's some planned obsolescence here.
Mm-hmm.
And both of those terms are important. God knew where this whole thing, where salvation history was going to go. And
Yeah.
it wasn't going to end with the theocracy. The theocracy is planned obsolescence.
Yeah.
There was a purpose in this, and now we're further down the road here. And so to criticize or turn away from the gospel because of something about that's really intimately attached to these distinctions you're talking about is really to misunderstand that, okay, it had a role, but now things are different, and this was all part of God's wisdom to do this. So I think I would agree again, that it's like, rather than just ditch the whole thing, maybe a better trajectory would be like actually teach people. This is planned obsolescence. Here's what it was supposed to do.
Well, and to teach people how to think it through, because it is complex. There are a lot of laws that in fact, I would say the law as a whole, we can't just take and apply. We can't just live it out today and expect it to have the same result. It's part of a cultural moment for Israel's history that has shifted by the time we get to Jesus' day, and it's shifted again in our day. And so we need to think carefully about how we can express believing loyalty in our cultural moment.
Yeah, wasn't it wise of God to not attach salvation to culture? In other words, there is no sanctified culture.
Yes.
But again, that's a point we miss because of the way we're accustomed to talking about these parts of the Old Testament.
Yes. And I think sometimes I'm guessing that this is maybe a danger with some of those who are really excited about your work and your podcast, that there could be a danger in discovering the Old Testament so much, like discovering its value so much, that we now crown the Old Testament as king over the New Testament.
What's that New Testament thing?
And that's the appendix. We don't need to really pay so much attention because we get all the good stuff in the Old Testament. And then to try to implement it, like to think, oh, Hebrew language is better than English, so I'm going to pray in Hebrew, and I'm going to try to eat the way they ate, and I'm going to try to wear what they wore, as if we're trying to recreate ancient Israelite culture in our day. And that's I think, equally unhelpful. You have the unhitching on one side, and then you have the full implementation of the law on the other extreme. And I don't think either one of those is the right solution. My book is trying to steer people in the middle and say, how is the Old Testament, how does it function as Christian scripture? How do we read it to form and inform our behavior, our ethics, etc.? So it all matters, but we're not just going to implement it wholesale.
Yeah, and also while not violating what it meant then.
Right. We're going to read it in its ancient context, and then we're going to know our current context well enough to know how these different dimensions that are covered by the law might be expressed. So I'll give you an example that came up in class. I was teaching Torah class back in September, October here at Prairie College. And we were talking about the laws of Exodus and Deuteronomy, and there's the law, I think it's in Deuteronomy.
Okay, the subtitle is Why Sinai Still Matters.
Mm-hmm.
So right away, I imagine you're going to either in class or in conversation, people are going to say, well, hey, that's a good question. Like, why does it matter? I thought we were free from the law, as Christians. So
yes,
what's behind the subtitle?
This is such a common misconception, and I believe that that this idea that we're free from the law and we don't have to think about it anymore, I think that it stems from a misunderstanding of what the law was there for to begin with. Mm-hmm. So if we view the law at Sinai as Israel's means of salvation, so they had this system whereby they had to keep all these rules in order to be saved, then of course when we come to Jesus, we know that we're saved by grace through faith, and so of course then the law becomes irrelevant and we put it aside. But I think that's a fundamental misunderstanding of what the law is for. Israel doesn't obey the law in order to be saved. The law comes beginning in chapter 20 of Exodus. A whole lot of stuff has already happened in the book, including God rescuing them from slavery in Egypt. Yeah. And it's not as though Moses shows up at the border of Egypt and says, hey guys, good news, I can get you out of here. Just sign on the dotted line and say you'll do these things and I will rescue you.
Yeah,
Um,
spiritual calisthenics,
no,
if you drop off the wayside, too bad.
they are delivered completely by grace, and they come to Sinai, and the first thing that God tells them is that they're his treasured people, and that he is making them into being a kingdom of priests. And to begin the Ten Commandments, he says, I am Yahweh your God who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So whatever the law is, it's not a means of salvation. It's not a means of bondage either. He's already set them free. And I think, in the law, he's outlining what it looks like to live in freedom, what believing loyalty looks like as a new nation. And so if we get that right and we get to Jesus, we see Jesus is saying, I haven't come to abolish the law, I've come to fulfill it. He's living out the covenant faithfully and modeling for us how to do so.
Yeah, what really helped me, years ago to sort of see what you just described, was one of the early things was that, what I call the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, that, you have the nations divorced, you have humanity divorced at Babel, and then it's God's choice to start over again with Israel, and then use Israel as a conduit through which the nations would be brought back. And so just that alone tells you, well, God's not sitting there thinking, okay, humanity, they're just a bunch of screw ups. So what other tests can I throw at them, knowing that they're going to screw? It just doesn't make any sense to come up with another contest or performance-based thing.
Right.
It just doesn't make any sense at all. And so that alone just sort of tells you, well, there must have been some other thing going on here. So he chooses to create Israel. He chooses to put himself into a covenant relationship with Abraham and by extension with Israel. And the law, it just seemed like, well, okay, here's a boots on the ground way.
Yes.
To show this relationship to the nations, because you are supposed to be a holy nation, something that's distinct to attract them back. You're supposed to do this, kingdom of priests thing. It really helped me think differently about it. And then when the whole that was clear to me, and then believing loyalty again is something that years ago I threw into unseen realm because it just seemed important at the time.
It's a great way to describe what's expected of Israel at Sinai, and it's still expected of us today.
Yeah, it was really,
our belief translates into action. It's not just about where we go when we die.
Yeah, and you need both terms. So that was really helpful. The other thing that sort of helped me was the discussion about the new perspective, because on the one hand, I mean, I don't know where you land on that, and I don't know exactly where I would completely land on that either. I'm still thinking about a lot of it, but just the notion that N.T. Wright was challenging about the works of the law, because we are prone to interpret that as Paul is opposing works salvation, and when you really think about it, it's like what Jew who really understood their Old Testament would think of the law that way?
Yeah, no.
I mean, how would that pop into their head?
Yeah. And I'm with you. I think I don't know that I fully decided where I land on new perspective stuff, but I do think that it's been really helpful in showing us that
at least let's take this off the list.
Yeah, right. Well, that Paul is responding and rejecting not the Old Testament law, but the ways it's been twisted and misinterpreted in his own day. And then we have that added layer of the Protestant reformers reading Paul through the lens of works salvation, which they see in their own culture. And so, I think we need to read the Old Testament more carefully. Paul is not doing away with the law any more than Jesus is doing away with the law. What they want to get rid of is a sense of legalism or a way of approaching God that is devoid of that relationship.
And in Paul's day devoid. Yeah, in Paul's day devoid of Jesus. Is that I think there's been I can't remember what the title of the book is, but there's been a recent Moore Seebeck book that goes back into the primary sources. Imagine that, about the works of the law phrase, just just sort
Yeah.
of a sweeping overview of how not only the Jewish community, but the early Christian community, was understanding that.
Yeah.
And basically what this book determines is Wright's observation about what's not being said here are correct. I mean, this is, what the discussion was. But the key other thought was what Paul and others were really after was how Judaism, and this isn't a works salvation thing. It plays into it possibly, but the idea of defining your relationship with God by means of this covenant only. So in Paul's day, it's like, he's trying to get his fellow Jews to not define themselves, without the fulfillment of the law, which is Jesus.
Sure.
So now our orientation point, to God is through the Messiah, through Jesus, and not this thing. But he's not like he's not attacking one thing so that the only thing left is this other.
Right.
There's more nuancing than that. So that has been pretty helpful, I thought. And I mean, I since I know your work, I kind of knew the trajectory that you were going to follow here. But yeah, this is important stuff that I think that if people are patient in really thinking about it, and your book's going to be a big help here, that they'll be able to think well about just this topic.
Yeah.